Nope.
The following is an old mountain tale that my great-grandpa used to tell my grandparents. My grandparents told their children, who told me, and now I'm sharing it with you. Back in the 1920s to the 1930s, a mining company moved into the holler where I was born, raised, and still live today. The mining company hired a bunch of young men to go around and test where they should open their mines. The way they did this was by taking black powder or dynamite, dropping it down the seams of the mountain, and eventually making a pretty big hole in the side of that mountain. The young men would then have a look around inside these holes, and the ones with the most seams of coal is where they would try to open a new mine. After my great-grandfather got out of prison for running and making moonshine, he needed a job to support his family. He went to the mining company and spoke to the owner. He was placed with the blasting crew to go look for more seams of coal. The owner had hoped to open at least 3 more mines in the area. Working on the blasting crew was extremely dangerous, but the pay was the highest you can get at the time. So my great-grandfather did what he had to do to support his family. One day, the crew, including my grandfather, blasted an already open cave. They were not supposed to do this, but the youngest of the crew decided to play around with the explosives that day. One of the crewmen tied the rope they used to keep track of the men entering the holes around his waist and decided to enter this now huge cave hole. The rope is extremely important because the man could get into trouble or the bottom of the hole could fall through with the man. If this happened, the crew members would grab the rope, praying it wouldn't somehow break, and pull the man back up to the surface. Anyways, the man entered the hole, crawling, looking around with his light while another crew member fed him the rope. After some time, the man stopped crawling and yelled to the crew that he heard something growling in the cave with him. The man in charge yelled back that it was just the mountain settling. After a bit more time, the man in the cave began to scream for help, demanding they remove him from the cave as quick as possible. The crew rushed to the rope and started pulling it with all their might. But something stronger than 4 grown men was in that hole. They pulled and they pulled, all the while hearing the crew members scream. All of a sudden, everything went quiet, and all 4 men fell to the ground. They rushed back up to their feet and began to pull the rope again. And this time, it was light. Too light. The end of the rope came back, covered in blood, without their crew member attached. All 4 men prepared themselves and made their way into the hole in an attempt to rescue the crew member. My great-grandfather said that there was an awful smell coming from inside, like rotting meat and sulfur. Once inside, it wasn't long until they all began to hear a demonic scream coming from deeper inside the hole. It was clear that whatever was making this noise was coming closer and closer to them. They could hear the digging and the screams getting louder and louder. At this, the crew began to run up the hill and make their way back down to where they had parked the truck, all except my great-grandfather. He did something he would regret for the rest of his life. He looked back at the hole. What he saw scared him so badly that he wet himself out of fear. Crawling out of this hole was something in the shape of a man, but was covered in blood and horns. This thing had massive horns on its head. He said it looked like a man had been skinned, and he was unable to make anything out on the face except for 2 slits of eyes and razor teeth where the mouth was supposed to be. This thing stood up, and it was massive. It let out another god-awful scream, and that's what broke the trance my great-grandfather was under. He then booked it back to the truck just as the men were pulling away. He barely jumped into the back as they drove off. The crew member driving the truck came out of the mountain trail all over the road, going as fast as the truck would allow. He nearly lost the men on the back trying to dodge a tree and barely got the truck back onto the road. When they arrived back in the mining office, they all jumped out of the truck screaming incoherently. It took the men hours to get stable enough to talk about what happened. My great-grandfather told the boss and the other men standing around every detail of what had happened in those mountains and what he had seen. Naturally, some of the people hearing this grew skeptical, including his boss, and he wanted to take the crew back there and see what had happened. One of the crew started crying and screaming, "No, no, I won't go." My great-grandfather, on the other hand, found his courage and told the boss he would take him back under one condition. They had to go with at least 10 men that all had to be armed to the brim with weapons. At that point, my great-grandfather said he was scared out of his mind, but he knew he would go crazy if he didn't know what that thing was. 2 hours later, my great-grandfather, the boss, and his armed men were making their way back up the mountain trail. After an hour or so, they came back to the spot where the crew had parked their truck the first time. All of them got out and began to climb the hill. At the top, my grandfather stopped and pointed to the hole. He said for them to go ahead, but that was as far as he was going. The boss and his men started to investigate. Blood was everywhere. It looked like a massacre had happened there. The ground, the rocks, and even higher parts of the trees were all covered in blood. The boss was speechless. Then someone noticed a blood trail. All of them, including my great-grandfather, began to follow it. The trail led deep into the woods, and at the end, they found a rawhide skin of some sort, and the blood gave way to prints. These prints were in the shape of a bear, but also crossed with an eagle. They were massive, and nobody was able to identify what exactly caused these prints, though it wouldn't take an expert to know that these types of claws can do some heavy damage. What was even scarier was that this thing was now walking on 2 legs. My great-grandfather looked at the prints for a second, and then his heart sank. The prints of this thing were leading them down the mountain trail, down to where people lived and had animals. He spoke up, telling everyone about it, and they all made a mad dash to their trucks. Whatever this thing was, they had a feeling it was hungry and that it wasn't going to stop until it was full. When they got back, everyone hurried and gathered up their families. Men were nailing boards over their windows, and women were crying as their husbands told them the story of what happened. That night, men and young boys were armed to protect themselves and their families. Some took to being on top of their houses to watch their livestock. Around midnight, they heard demonic screams coming from the woods. At some point, one of the men's cows was attacked. A man ran out to see what was happening, gun at the ready. He saw the cow down on the ground, not moving, not doing anything. Then he began to hear crunching and slurping. He slowly made his way around the cow to have a look. What he saw was in the shape of a man, but he was able to see the bones coming out of its body. Through the blood, he was able to see its horns and claws, massive horns and claws. This thing had gutted this cow and was now eating it. The man was so scared that he ran back to his house and grabbed his Bible before beginning to pray to God. My great-grandfather said they had to deal with this thing night after night for a full year, until one night they cornered it. They shot this thing full of bullets, but somehow it still managed to get away from them. He swears up and down the thing lived and took to the woods for protection. He said every now and then an animal would still go missing, and that's how he knew raw hide and bloody bones was still out there in the woods, waiting for his next meal. After telling us this story when we were children, he would give the warning that if we didn't behave ourselves, raw hide and bloody bones would come for us next. My great-grandfather swore this story was true until the day he died at the age of 93. Hello, dear listener, and thank you for joining me in this week's video. Special thank you to Christina Mounts, otherwise known as Lil Mama 85, for submitting the story my way. I'll leave a link down in the description below where you can discover more of her work if you're interested. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to smack that like button down below and subscribe for future videos if you haven't done so already. Speaking of which, we are closely approaching 10,000 subscribers for this channel, and I want to do something big to commemorate. If you have any suggestions, let me know in the comments below. Maybe a themed video, or another reaction to something scary where you can see me pee my pants, or maybe a challenge video, but hopefully something that doesn't involve eating detergent, you know. Anyway, until next time everybody, stay safe out there. I'll be seeing you in the next video.